Hi, good afternoon. Welcome. We'll give everyone a minute to get logged on and kind of get settled in. I want to say thank you so much for being here. My name is Amber Brown. I am the Development Marketing Manager at the Ayn Rand Institute, and we are here to celebrate Ayn Rand's 120th birthday as well as listen to Raymond Newman's 1980 interviews with Ayn Rand. And today I am happy to be joined by ARI archivist Brandon Lisi. Hey, Brandon, thank you so much for being here today.
To give a shout out to just all the donors here. Thank you so much for all your support, licensing interviews, doing all the work that we do. That's what makes it possible.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much to all of our donors who make this program and everything the Ayn Rand Institute does possible. And I, for one, am so thankful that Ayn Rand was born today and that she went on to struggle to create the artwork she did. They have greatly influenced my life. But I'd like to know, Brandon, did Ayn Rand have any special birthday rituals? Did she have any favorite gifts or anything that was meaningful to her on this day?
Yeah, well, the one story that I know that I always love comes to us from Leonard Peikoff, actually. So this was in the late 1960s. At that time, Leonard Peikoff and a lot of the students that surrounded Rand were sort of either academics or PhD students, didn't exactly have a lot of money. And the people around her, compared to Rand, who was, a well-established best-selling author, she insisted, she's like, listen, I don't want gifts for my birthday. Your presence is sort of value enough. But Leonard Peikoff says that one year he decided to actually break that rule. Rand had always talked about the value of music, as particularly art that she had engaged with when she was a young person living under the oppressive Soviet regime. She basically talked about this style of music called tiddlywinks that she had, engaged with when she was really young. And it was this sort of lighthearted kind of music that meant something to her personally. But the thing that I think is really sort of fascinating is that she was really couldn't find copies of this music when she was an adult, and sort of, had like sheet music and things like that, but couldn't actually find the original recordings because they just simply didn't exist anymore. So Leonard Peikoff, who actually knew how to play the piano, was able to get a copy of the sheet music and went to a recording studio, recorded himself playing this music, this music, the lighthearted music that she had heard listening to in Russia, and brought it to this recording studio, recording himself playing it, recorded both sides of the vinyl record, and brought it to Ayn Rand for her birthday one year. And Rand, when she saw that he had brought a gift, was a little disappointed. He remembers, but then when she opened it and realized what it was, that that it was Leonard himself, recording this copy of this music that she had engaged with. She immediately lit up, listened to it over and over and over again, and she recalls that Leonard recalls that it was something deeply personally meaningful for her. So that's the one story I know of that she kind of insisted on no gifts, but in this particular case, it was just something that she valued and deeply appreciated.
That sounds very heartfelt and meaningful, and a total surprise. Now, are there any special resources that we can call out for people to be able to read about Ayn Rand on this special occasion of her 120th birthday?
Well, because I imagine a lot of the people listening today are, pretty big fans of Rand and have probably listened to and engaged with a lot of stuff already. One of the lesser known resources I suggest you go to archives.org, AynRand.org/archives. Go to our Letters of Ayn Rand exhibit, where you can find, I think it's almost 600 letters written by Ayn Rand, where you can really get a sense of this incredible person just based on the things that she was writing to fans, to politicians, You really get, I think, a sense of her that you really don't get anywhere else. Now, the original volume was, of course, edited by Mike Berliner. You can find that in print. But this online version has the original scanned pages as well as all of the transcripts. So I encourage you to read that. And out of that collection, if there's one I wanted to highlight, if you haven't read it, for people listening today, read her letter to the fans of the Fountainhead. It's an incredible letter, absolutely worth your time. It basically, in about 7 pages, describes her journey to this successful career that we all know and love and are inspired by. So if you haven't read that letter, check it out. Again, the link is aynrand.org/archives.
Excellent. So yes, if you want to read more, aynrand.org/archives, and a special recommendation for the letter to readers of the Fountainhead, which I think is number 596. So on this special day, we are going to share, we're going to listen to Raymond Newman's interviews with Ayn Rand. Now, we'll be listening to them in sequence, so it'll just be one seamless experience, one interview. But this was actually 2 interviews done with Ayn Rand. What is it, Brandon, that makes these interviews unique? Out of all of Rand's interviews, what is particularly valuable about these?
Great question. If I had to call out one particular quality, because there's a lot to choose from here, Rand gives some very extensive and nuanced answers in this pair of interviews about how to reach moral judgment. And I think all of us in our lives often face challenges with regard to, you meet somebody who, let's say, is of mixed premises, and you don't know how to reach a judgment. Should I deal with them? Should I engage with them? And she gives really extensive answers in this particular interview that I don't know that she gives everywhere else or anywhere else. And as a result of that, I highly recommend, listen to the full thing. I think you'll come away with a new perspective on how to live your life. And for Rand, that's what philosophy was all about. It's not a floating abstraction, but really the concretes for here living on Earth.
Good. Now, as we've said, these interviews occurred in 1980. Can you tell us a bit more about where Ayn Rand is in 1980 in her life, in her career, and personally, kind of what's going on with Ayn Rand?
The unfortunate thing to always mention with regard to this period is that the year prior, in 1979, she had lost her husband, Frank O'Connor. They were married since 1929. And of course, that was a pretty significant loss for her. But that doesn't mean that her career or her work was over. In fact, she continued to engage with interviews like these, both on television and on radio. She was still giving talks at the Ford Hall Forum. So she was still promoting her ideas in the world. One really interesting sort of piece of the career that I think especially fascinating, and it's the last question that gets talked about here, was Rand's work on the film and or television adaptation of Atlas Shrugged. So in 1972, there had been the producer of The Godfather, Al Ruddy, who actually approached Ayn Rand about acquiring the rights to the Atlas Shrugged. That deal fell through. In 1979, or maybe a little earlier, NBC had a contract, or there was some kind of an arrangement whereby they would turn Atlas Shrugged into a television miniseries. That is still sort of in hiatus at the time of this interview. But the thing that she will eventually do, starting at maybe around the time of this interview and then going forward, she realizes that, if this is going to happen, she is going to have to write and produce her own adaptation of the novel. And she had been making plans around this time to go back to Hollywood to make that a reality. Unfortunately, she did pass in, I believe, March of 1982. So not very long after this interview you're about to hear. But I think what's really fascinating is that she was still working at these things that were deeply valuable and meaningful to her. And then most importantly, she was still as sharp as ever, as I think this interview will demonstrate.
It would have been so fabulous had she been able to complete her work on an Atlas Shrugged television miniseries, but to the best of our knowledge, this is one of her last, it is her last substantive interview. It is about an hour. So Ayn Rand gave her final Ford Hall Forum talk on April 26th in 1981, which was The Age of Mediocrity. Her final public lecture was actually in November 21st of 1981, which was called The Sanction of the Victims. And then her final television interview was that same day on the Louis Riker show, but that interview is only about 5 minutes long. So here we have an hour. What can you tell me about the interviewer? Who is Raymond Newman, and what's his radio show all about?
Oh my goodness. Yeah. So the Raymond Newman Journal, I've had the distinct pleasure of learning a lot about. I'm sorry to say that Raymond Newman passed away about a year and a half ago, but I have had, like I said, the distinct honor to learn a lot about him from his family. So, of course, first of all, big shout out to the copyright holder of this interview who granted us the license to share this all with you. That's Judy Newman. Big thank you to their daughter, Kira, who shared a couple of little interesting pieces of trivia with us. I'll just tell you that Raymond Newman was a very fascinating person who had served in the Korean War. He was actually the son of somebody who had escaped Russia himself. So I guess that you might say was a little bit of a connection between him and Rand, that, he had descended from someone who had also escaped the Soviet Union. I know from speaking with Judy Newman that Raymond's real passion was going into some sort of field in communication, but that he had sort of started his career in law, in accounting. He had his own law firm, and that by 1980 he was, I think, almost 50 years old when this interview was recorded. Had decided that he wants to actually kind of fulfill this dream and create his own radio show. So of course the first guest that he picks out was Ayn Rand, right? Because as a matter of fact, he was somebody who was a really passionate fan of Ayn Rand, had apparently notes in his sort of records of classes that he took from Rand. I know that he had listened to her at the Ford Hall Forum. And Rand was, of course, not the only guest that Raymond Newman had ever had. So, he would, later interview the governor of Pennsylvania. He interviewed jazz legend Benny Goodman. For those of you who don't know who Benny Goodman is, he's kind of a dated reference, but he's like one of the biggest jazz legends of all time. People call him the King of Swing. He interviewed an Olympic figure skater, John Curry. So, all talking about like current events, things that were at the forefront of people's minds. I think really trying to integrate the sort of philosophical things that he was deeply passionate about with the things happening all around us. And I think the thing that's really cool, just getting to hear from his family, is that he's somebody who had a great passion for teaching. He was a tutor in a lot of different standardized tests, taught the LSAT, taught, the SAT. So it's been a real privilege to, I think, get to learn about this man, and hope that in some small way we can honor him too, along with Ayn Rand, for the fact that the two of them, I think, had a great interview together, and it's a real treasure that we get to bring it to you today.
He sounds like a true Renaissance man with many talents and a passion for sharing ideas and finding ways to communicate them. And I'm thrilled he conceived of a radio show and wanted to ask Ayn Rand a bunch of questions. Now, this interview is 45 years old. What sorts of issues and events are at the forefront of people's minds at this time?
Right. So the first thing that's important to call out is that this was recorded in October of 1980. And so it's about a couple of weeks before Ronald Reagan's landslide victory against Jimmy Carter in the presidential election of 1980. And she actually mentions at the end of the interview, she talks about how there's this swing to the right. But she says that there's a lack of intellectual leadership, and she's like, well, I won't mention them by name, but certain presidential candidates that I'm particularly frustrated with. So she is referring to Reagan there, which I think is pretty interesting. But then the other thing that comes up is Raymond Newman calls out the fact that, we see in America today this extraordinary rise in violence, right? And if you look at the sort of violent crime statistics from that era, whether it's murder rate or some other, violent crime, way to measure that data, 1980 is a particular it's one of the peaks that you see. Like it had doubled the murder rate since like the late 1960s, 1970s, or so forth, which is really troubling. I think for people living in America at the time, that it probably, particularly after the Vietnam War, after the Watergate scandal, these kinds of statistics, it may have felt like at that time that America was collapsing. And yet here is Ayn Rand stepping into that vacuum to provide a positive of her own and to really sort of say that, like, yeah, all of these things are a problem, but here's a real solution. Not just that there are problems, but that there are solutions to those problems. And this is how we go forward. And that's, I think, part of the reason why this interview is so special to me.
Yes, because she is still here today, providing that real positive for us for sure. Now, a couple questions with the archives. How did you come to know that this particular interview existed?
Well, luckily for us, here at the Ayn Rand Archives, we have preserved hundreds, maybe even thousands of hours of audio here in our archival holdings, including this interview. And part of our work is to go out into the world, license these interviews, ensure that we have gained the clearance from the copyright holders to guarantee that we are respecting property rights. That's very important. But then also to make sure that we're comprehensive, that you, the audience, you, the people who support Ayn Rand, support us, that you get to hear every last bit of audio or anything that Rand ever written, that it's accessible to you. So we're aware of it because the very hard work of people who have worked here at the archive since it was founded in 1995 to literally hold on to every scrap of media that Ayn Rand basically ever came in contact with. So we're very lucky to have that as a resource, and it's my distinct honor to play a small role in bringing that to you.
I'm thrilled that you're bringing it to us, and I have a quick question from the audience, which is, do you have an idea how many more interviews or how many more items that we will be able to publish?
Well, just off the top of my head, I mean, I can think of about a dozen, right? I mean, just a couple weeks ago or maybe a few months ago, we released the second interview between Rand and Mike Wallace. I don't know that that was ever available online, up until, we released it. I mean, we still have the third interview, too soon to be released, soon to be scheduled. So stay tuned for that. That's just like one example of like a fantastic interview that's out there. Now, one of the things that animates my work is that, Rand spoke at a lot of colleges, spoke at a lot of like different venues. And my understanding is that a lot of times these things are recorded and preserved in corporate and university archives all across the country and sometimes all across the world. And it's now our job to go out and find them. So if that work, is something that you think is worthwhile, please consider, donating to the Institute, because that is going to fund this work to bring more of that material that nobody's ever heard before. And maybe in some cases, people don't even know what they have. People don't even realize that this is like an undated piece of audio from Ayn Rand. And only, people like us, people listening today, people in the archives can really appreciate the historical value of it. So that's something that really animates my work. So I wish I had a better answer to like how many are there. Let's put it this way. I think there's probably enough to sustain the work that we're doing for the rest of my life. I think that
Perfect.
we won't stop, and we won't stop until every single last piece of audio is made available to you.
Good. Thank you for that. And anytime you do want to donate to the Ayn Rand Institute specifically for the archives, you absolutely can. Just make a note in the comments, or if you send a check, just write a memo for the archives, and then your entire donation will go to our work like this. So, Brandon, you have heard this interview before. Do you have a favorite question or answer that occurs in this broadcast?
Absolutely. And it's hard not to pick the one that we clipped just the other week. So I think it was last week or maybe a few days ago. We clipped it and
Yep.
sort of shared it as a preview for this event, which Raymond Newman asks Ayn Rand. He says, well, what is the purpose of life? And the thing I love about the answer, not just Rand's, like, the exact answers that she gives, which I won't spoil here if you haven't heard it yet, but that she unpacks that question, that there's an assumption built into the question which is invalid. and that she doesn't just take the question for granted as like, okay, well, like, what's like the little thing. And that has been very instructive for me, right? When people ask me philosophical questions, when people come to me with like, they're looking for guidance on their life, it's not merely enough to just sort of read, sort of like the literal sort of, question itself, but to ask, okay, what is the deeper meaning? What philosophical premises are built in? And I think you'll see here that Ayn Rand absolutely does that. And it's a real powerful example that I think to follow. And, we're constantly striving to follow.
That's exactly right. And for me personally, I know that every time I listen to this interview in its entirety, I have a new favorite interaction, a new favorite quote or nugget to move forward with and chew and ponder. I enjoy when she speaks about, the relationships with our family or, gun control and what she has to say
Mm.
about, if the government collapses, what does gun control mean? So every time I listen, I really admire, her sharpness and clarity on every topic and the way, as you said, that she really gets to the meat of the question. And I'm ready to listen to this interview, Brandon. Thank you so much for being here with me.
Well, thank you again for having me, and see you all at the next time we have more audio to release, which is sure to be very soon.
That's exactly right. And I do want to say also thank you to everyone for tuning in. We're very excited to share this interview. And again, ARI is funded exclusively by individuals like you who value Ayn Rand's works and ideas, and supporting our work means bringing her ideas to an ever widening audience of people. So stay tuned here. This link, this video will go right into our YouTube premiere of Raymond Newman's interviews with Ayn Rand. Thank you.